Okay, there we go. We're sharing screen. So today we're going to talk about counterplan strategy. We've already talked a lot about this in the last three videos, so I'm not going to try to hammer it home too much. But I just want you to think about before you get to a debate, before you're even in the debate, what's your strategy and how are you going to execute it? Because in novice and in rookie, you have a very basic strategy, right? You're just trying to prove that the affirmative causes bad things or doesn't cause good things, or if you're the affirmative, try and prove that the affirmative causes good things, right? Now, as a JVer with the counterplan, you have more options for what you get to say. So we're just going to talk about that briefly today. So again, the counterplan helps tell the story to the judge of why they should vote negative, but you don't have to directly disagree with the plan. You can say the plan has some good components, but we want to change this one thing to do it differently to set up the tension, the distinction between these two things. So we can do the counter plan instead of doing the plan. And as the negative, you want to say that you can do all the best parts of the plan without the problem of the disadvantage. So for the counter plan strategy for the negative, as the negative, here's what you need to read in the 1NC for sure. And here's what you need to win by the end of the debate, what you need to convince the judge of. First, you need to prove that the counter plan solves the problems that the 1AC lays out. So if the 1AC says, if we take guns away from police, then there won't be so many shootings and also it'll increase their legitimacy. Okay, well, the negative just has to say, well, whatever we do as a counter plan also does that. That way, if you solve the plan through the counter plan, then you're at equal footing as the affirmative, right? Second thing you need to do is you need to show that the counter plan avoids the disadvantage. So that means you have to use the disadvantage in the 1NC and also that the counter plan doesn't cause the disadvantage. So with the current topic that you're using, the state's counter plan plus the state power DA, that's really easy to prove, right? Because the story of the state power DA is that the plan will take power away from the state governments and give it to the national governments, whereas the counter plan has the states still doing the plan, so they maintain the power. Then the third thing you need to prove is that the disadvantage is bad or that it causes bad things, right? If the disadvantage is true, then bad things will happen. So if you've already proven that the counter plan also solves the plan, counter plan doesn't cause the disadvantage, and that if the disadvantage happens, it would be bad, you basically won the debate, right? Because you're showing the judge that the counter plan will cause exactly as many good things as the plan, but it will also not cause the bad things that passing the plan would cause. So you win the debate. If the affirmative doesn't answer these points, you will win the debate as the negative. But speaking of the affirmative, what should you do as the affirmative? So the affirmative has two options. Like we talked about before, the first option is to basically play defense. You can say, actually the counter plan does not solve the problems laid out by the affirmative. And if it doesn't solve the problems laid out by the affirmative, then the affirmative does more good than the counter plan does. So you should vote for the affirmative instead of the counter plan. And you can say the counter plan doesn't avoid the disadvantage. So even if the judge passes the counter plan, if the counter plan causes the disadvantage and the affirmative causes the disadvantage, then the disadvantage basically doesn't have any impact, right? Because if both plans cause it, then there's no reason to vote either affirmative or negative based on the disadvantage. The third part of this option is you should say that the plan does solve the problem and does avoid the disadvantage. So again, you have to go back to your 1AC and you have to say, in the 1AC, we said, if you pass the plan, it'll do these good things. You have to go back and reiterate that. And, if the negative is doing their job right, if they run this counter plan, they really shouldn't be disagreeing with the affirmative because they want to solve the same problems in mostly the same way. So if they're disagreeing with the affirmative, those arguments also hurt them on the negative. So it should be really easy to go back to the plan and say, hey, we said we would solve all these problems. They don't really disagree. And then the fourth thing you need to do is make a permutation. If you remember from the last two videos, a permutation is just saying, hey, we can do the affirmative and the negative plans both at the same time with no problems. And you want to do this because even if you prove that the counter plan is a less good option and that it causes the disadvantage and that the plan is better, you still want to have some security and be able to say, you know, judge, even if you don't believe us that the current plan is bad and that it causes a disadvantage, if you can do both at the same time and avoid those problems, then the judge should do that, right? So it takes like, I don't know, 15 seconds to make a permutation argument, and it's a really good security blanket for you. So this option is a good way to show that the affirmative produces more good than the negative. And it's the more intuitive way of dealing with it, right? In real life, if you're having an argument and you say like, we should do this one thing, and someone else says, no, we shouldn't do that, we should do this other thing, you usually don't, the normal move is not to try to combine them, right? The normal move is try to say, okay, well, I still think my idea is a really good idea, and your idea is maybe not as good as you thought it was. So we should still stick with the first idea. That's basically what option one is saying, you know, the affirmative idea is still a really good idea. This counter plan, maybe not such a good idea, maybe not as much evidence or argument to back it up. The second option is a very different type of argument. So in the second option, you're playing a lot more offense rather than defense. So for a second option, you could say the counter plan doesn't solve the problem because you want, and you should probably also still say that the affirmative does solve the problem laid out by the affirmative. So you take care of their solvency arguments. You say, we solve the problem, they don't solve the problem. And then you'll notice in option one, the play was to say both the counter plan and the plan link to the disadvantage, cause the disadvantage. In option two, you're not going to say that, right? You're gonna agree with them and say that the counter plan does not cause the disadvantage. But what you're going to say is that the impact of the disadvantage actually goes the other way. So in this case, you're going to say, okay, even if the plan does take power away from the states and gives it to the national government, that's a good thing, because when states have power, that's really bad. And when the national government has power, that's really good. So turning the disadvantage is basically saying, okay, only the affirmative causes the disadvantage, but it would be good if the disadvantage happened. And the counter plan does not cause the disadvantage, which is bad because the disadvantage is actually a good thing when it happens. So that way you can make a pretty offense-based argument and use a lot of the arguments of the negative against them, right? Because you're agreeing the counter plan doesn't link to the disadvantage. The affirmative does link to the disadvantage. The disadvantage is unique. It's not happening right now. You agree with all of their points so that you can make up, you can set up an argument here where if you turn the disadvantage, you have a lot of good offense for the affirmative. And again, I said this last time, but I think option two is the better option here. It's more efficient, and I think it's stronger. So okay, that's the same slide. But what I meant to have here is, what do you do as the affirmative, or what do you do as the negative if the affirmative does this to you, right? If it's option one, then all you have to do is answer the permutation, answer the solvency arguments on the counter plan, basically say the counter plan does still solve the problem, and then just reiterate that the counter plan avoids the disadvantage. And I think those are pretty easy arguments for you to make as the negative. You have really good evidence that says all of that, and I think it's a pretty good position to be in as the negative. I think for option two, things are a lot more difficult. You can still make the argument that the counter plan solves the problem of the affirmative as well or better than the affirmative, and you have good evidence to make that. Both sides have good evidence on that question. But when it comes to turning the disadvantage, you lose a lot of your advantage as the negative when the affirmative tries to turn the disadvantage, right? Because at the end of every debate, the counter plan and the plan are going to solve the problem about equally. The real question of the counter plan debate is what happens with the disadvantage? And this is what the counter plan is useful for, right? Is the counter plan nullifies or takes away all of that work that the 1AC did to say why their plan is so good, why it solves all these problems. You just say, yeah, okay, you know, we kind of agree, but we can do this other thing that's basically the same. So we both solve this problem. The real question is, who causes the disadvantage, and is the disadvantage a good thing or a bad thing? So if the affirmative takes option two as the negative in either the 1NR or the 2NC, you're going to have to figure out ways to be able to say that the disadvantage is actually a bad thing if it happens. Because they basically say, if they're doing this right, the affirmative should be saying yeah, the disadvantage is unique and it links to the plan, doesn't link to the counter plan. All that's left is to debate the impact level. So as the negative, you have to be really ready to go read evidence and explain evidence about how when you take power away from the states and give it to the national government, that's a really bad thing. And you need to be able to look at your evidence and your arguments, as well as make impact weighing claims and compare your world versus the affirmative's world. So I think this this strategy is better for the affirmative and it puts the negative in a more difficult position. But also, as the negative, if you really know your evidence and you know what's coming up, you're going to be able to make this argument really well and very strongly. So again, in terms of the strategy, it's really all about preparation. It's all about figuring out what option you want to go with and being able, and as the negative, being ready to answer both options put out by the affirmative. And at the end of the day, I mean, you have to remember you're trying to tell a story here, right? It's not about all these little arguments all over the flow. It's about explaining holistically on a bigger level what's happening for the judge. So if at the end of the debate, you can tell them, you know, let's say you're taking option one as the affirmative. At the end of the debate, you have to be able to explain to them, you know, they haven't disagreed with our affirmative. They say we solved the problem, but there's some question about whether they are able to solve this problem or not. And also on the disadvantage level, it's not clear that we link to the disadvantage, but it's clear that they might link to the disadvantage too. So therefore, judge, it's obvious we solved the problem and everything else is sort of a question. So you vote affirmative based on the fact that we solve actual tangible problems right now, right? These are different stories that you have to tell at the end of the debate, and you have to be ready to tell them differently depending on what happens in the debate. And that's why the counter plan is reserved for junior varsity, is because there's more options, there's more different things that can happen in the debate to make the stories change by the end of the debate. And as a more advanced debater, this is going to be your job in the future, is to really track what's going on in these debates and figure out how you can respond and how you can continue telling your story based on what arguments and evidence is used. So good luck. That's the end of this video series for the state's counter plan. I hope you have some good JV debates. I hope you get good feedback from your judges, and I hope you and your coaches talk to figure out what strategy you're going to try to use before you get into this. So good luck.